A royal baby is born in the grandest palace in Europe. The doctors take one look and immediately turn pale. The infant's jaw protrudes so severely that he cannot close his mouth. His tongue hangs grotesquely, too large for his deformed skull. Within hours, the Pope himself receives an urgent letter, and what he reads makes him issue a decree that will echo through centuries. This is not fiction. This is the true horror story of what happens when bloodlines become so tangled that nature itself rebels. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why the Catholic Church took the unprecedented step of banning an entire dynasty from ever ruling again. But before we dive into this disturbing tale, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because we're about to uncover one of history's most closely guarded secrets that they desperately tried to erase from the history books. Let me take you back to 1516, to the golden age of the Spanish Empire, when Spain ruled half the known world. Gold flowed from the Americas like rivers, and the Spanish crown was the most powerful force on earth. But behind the golden facade of the Habsburg dynasty lay a secret so dark, so twisted, that it would eventually bring the mightiest empire to its knees. The Habsburgs didn't just rule Spain. They controlled Austria, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and vast territories across the globe. And they had one obsession that consumed them more than conquest, more than wealth, more than God himself: keeping their blood pure. You see, the Habsburg family believed that their royal blood was sacred, blessed by God himself. They believed that mixing their blood with commoners, or even with other noble families outside their immediate circle, would dilute their divine right to rule. So they made a decision that would curse their lineage for generations. They decided to marry each other, not just distant cousins, mind you. We're talking about uncles marrying nieces, first cousins marrying first cousins, and in some cases, even closer relations that would make your skin crawl. They did this generation after generation after generation, creating a family tree that looked less like a tree and more like a tangled web or a closed circle. At first, the consequences weren't immediately obvious. Emperor Charles V, who ruled in the early 1500s, was relatively normal, though he did have that distinctive Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower jaw that became their trademark feature. But his son, Philip II, already showed more pronounced deformities. His jaw jutted out even further. His face was longer and more asymmetrical. Yet he was still functional, still able to rule, still able to lead armies and manage an empire. But the genetic time bomb was already ticking, and each generation, the fuse grew shorter. Philip II married 4 times, and here's where it gets truly disturbing. His 4th wife, Anne of Austria, was not just some random princess. She was his own niece, the daughter of his sister. When their son Philip III was born, the doctors noted with concern that his deformities were worse than his father's. His jaw protruded so far forward that he could barely chew food. He had to have servants specially prepare his meals into soft pastes. His tongue was too large for his mouth, causing him to drool constantly. Servants followed him with cloths to wipe his face, and royal portraitists were ordered to paint him from angles that minimized his deformities. But Philip III could still function, could still produce heirs, could still maintain the illusion of royal grandeur. Now, Philip III needed to produce an heir, and the family's obsession with pure blood only intensified. They arranged for him to marry Margaret of Austria, and if you think the family relationships couldn't get more twisted, buckle up. Margaret was not only his cousin, but due to previous intermarriages in their family tree, she was related to him through multiple bloodlines. When you mapped out their family tree, you discovered that they were connected through at least 4 different paths. Genetically speaking, they were as closely related as siblings. This is where modern science helps us understand the horror of what was happening. Every human carries genetic mutations, little errors in our DNA. When two unrelated people have children, the chances of both parents passing the same bad gene to their child is relatively low. But when close relatives reproduce, both parents often carry the same mutations, and the probability of passing on double copies of defective genes skyrockets. It's like playing Russian roulette, except every chamber has a bullet. When Philip III and Margaret had their son, the future Philip IV, the baby showed even more severe deformities. His jaw was so pronounced that there was a gap of nearly an inch between his upper and lower teeth when his mouth was closed. He couldn't eat solid food properly. He suffered from constant digestive problems because he couldn't chew. His speech was slurred and difficult to understand. Royal advisors had to lean in close to decipher his words. But the family's attitude was denial at its most extreme. They commissioned paintings that showed Philip IV as handsome and strong, lying to themselves and their subjects about the reality of what was happening to their bloodline. Philip IV knew he needed an heir, and the family's solution was the same poisoned medicine that was killing them: more intermarriage. They arranged for him to marry Mariana of Austria, and the relationship between these two should make your stomach turn. Mariana was Philip's own niece. She was the daughter of his sister Maria and Emperor Ferdinand III. Philip was 42 years old when he married his 15-year-old niece. Let that sink in. He was marrying a girl who called him uncle her entire childhood. Their first child, a daughter, survived but was sickly and weak. Their second child, a son named Philip Prospero, seemed initially healthier, and the entire empire celebrated. Finally, an heir who might escape the curse. But by age 2, little Philip Prospero began showing alarming symptoms. He had seizures, violent convulsions that terrified his caretakers. His head was misshapen, larger on one side than the other. His legs were weak and twisted, and he couldn't walk properly even by age 3. He drooled constantly and couldn't control his tongue. The royal doctors, the best in Europe, tried everything: bloodletting, herbal remedies, prayers, even exorcisms, because some believed the child was possessed by demons. Nothing worked. Philip Prospero died just before his 4th birthday, and the empire mourned, but worse was yet to come. Mariana was pregnant again, and this time the entire Catholic world prayed for a healthy heir. In 1661, she gave birth to another son, and they named him Carlos, Charles II in English, though history would remember him by a more disturbing name, Charles the Bewitched. The moment Carlos was born, the midwives gasped in horror. His head was grotesquely oversized, covered with hair that grew down onto his face. His jaw protruded so far forward that his lower teeth were positioned almost an inch in front of his upper teeth. His tongue was so massive and deformed that it filled his mouth entirely, hanging out constantly, covered in drool. He couldn't nurse properly, couldn't suckle, and had to be fed with special instruments. As Carlos grew, if you can call his existence growing, the full extent of the genetic catastrophe became apparent. He didn't speak his first word until he was 4 years old, and even then, his speech was barely comprehensible gurgling sounds. He didn't walk until he was 8 years old, and even then he stumbled and fell constantly, requiring servants to catch him. His legs were so weak and deformed that he needed support to move. His mind was even more damaged than his body. He had the intellectual capacity of a young child trapped in an adult's body. He suffered from constant seizures, sometimes dozens in a single day. He would foam at the mouth, his eyes rolling back, his twisted body convulsing on the palace floors while horrified courtiers looked on. The Spanish court was in absolute panic. This creature, and I use that word because that's how many described him in private letters that have survived. This creature was the heir to the greatest empire on earth. Foreign ambassadors who met Carlos wrote shocked dispatches to their home countries. The French ambassador described him as having a face that looks like it was assembled from spare parts, with a jaw that makes him appear more beast than man. The Austrian envoy wrote that the king cannot chew his food, cannot speak clearly, and appears to not understand even simple conversations. One Italian priest who visited the court wrote in his private journal that he believed Carlos was evidence of God's judgment against the Habsburg family for their sins. But what were these sins? The family knew. Behind closed doors, some of the more educated nobles and doctors understood that the inbreeding was causing these horrors. But the family was so committed to their ideology of pure blood that they couldn't stop. In fact, they doubled down. When it came time for Carlos to marry, and yes, they expected this severely disabled man to produce heirs, they arranged not one but two marriages for him, both to close relatives. His first wife was Marie Louise of Orleans, but after she failed to produce children and died mysteriously, possibly poisoned, they married him to Maria Anna of Neuburg, another relative. Neither marriage produced children, which was actually a mercy, though no one saw it that way at the time. Modern medical analysis of Carlos's condition, based on detailed descriptions from the time and portraits, reveals just how catastrophic the genetic damage was. Scientists believe he suffered from two rare genetic disorders that only manifest when both parents carry the same recessive genes. The first was mandibular prognathism, the extreme jaw protrusion that was the Habsburg trademark taken to its most extreme form. The second was combined pituitary hormone deficiency, which explained his physical and mental disabilities, his seizures, and his overall failure to develop properly. Recent studies have calculated Carlos's inbreeding coefficient, a measure of how genetically similar his parents were. The result was shocking. Carlos was more inbred than the offspring of a direct sibling relationship. His parents, despite being uncle and niece, were so entangled in previous generations of Habsburg intermarriage that genetically they were closer than siblings. Carlos was essentially the child of two people who shared more DNA than normal brothers and sisters. The Spanish court refused to accept reality. They convinced themselves that Carlos was cursed, literally bewitched by enemies of Spain using black magic. They brought in exorcists who performed elaborate rituals, screaming prayers over the convulsing king while he whimpered in confusion. They even exhumed the corpses of his ancestors, believing that someone had cursed the royal tombs. Can you imagine the scene? In the crypts beneath the palace, in the middle of the night, they opened the coffins of dead kings and queens, examining the decayed remains for signs of hexes or magical tampering. They found nothing, of course, because the curse wasn't supernatural. It was written into Carlos's very DNA, passed down through generations of siblings coupling with siblings, uncles with nieces, cousins with cousins. The king's daily life was a grotesque tragedy. He required constant care like an infant. Servants had to dress him, feed him, clean him when he soiled himself, which was frequent. He had a special chair that supported his weak body. He would sit for hours, drooling, staring at nothing, occasionally mumbling incomprehensible sounds. On bad days, he would have seizure after seizure, his twisted body thrashing while doctors stood helplessly by. He was terrified of everything, plagued by nightmares and paranoia. He once ordered the execution of his own barber because he believed the man was trying to poison him through his hair. The order was quietly ignored by his advisors, who had to make most actual governing decisions because Carlos couldn't comprehend state affairs. Now, here's where the Catholic Church enters the story in force. Pope Innocent XI had been receiving reports about Carlos for years. The Church had always been ambivalent about the Habsburg intermarriages. On one hand, keeping power within Catholic royal families helped the Church's influence. On the other hand, the results were becoming impossible to ignore. When Carlos proved unable to produce heirs, and when it became clear that the Spanish Habsburg line would end with him, The Pope saw an opportunity. In a private letter that was later leaked and caused scandal across Europe, Pope Innocent wrote that he believed the Habsburg deformities were a sign of God's displeasure with incestuous marriages, even if they were technically legal under church law. The Pope couldn't officially ban the Habsburgs from marrying each other without admitting the church had been wrong to allow it in the first place. But he found another way. Through careful diplomatic maneuvering, the Pope and his advisors began promoting matches between the Habsburgs and other royal families. They used their influence to arrange marriages that would dilute the poisoned bloodline. When Carlos died in 1700 at the age of 38, barely functional until the end, the Spanish throne passed to a French prince, Philip of Anjou, from the Bourbon family. This succession sparked the War of Spanish Succession, one of the bloodiest conflicts in European history, but it also ended the Spanish Habsburg line forever. The Austrian Habsburgs continued, but even they began to marry outside the family more frequently, slowly purifying their bloodline over generations. The Pope, in private audiences with Catholic monarchs across Europe, began strongly discouraging close relative marriages, using the Spanish Habsburgs as a cautionary tale. While there was never an official papal bull specifically banning the Habsburgs from anything, because there were no Spanish Habsburgs left to ban, the Church's attitude toward royal inbreeding changed dramatically. They tightened the rules about consanguinity, requiring more distant relationships before marriage was permitted. They revoked many of the special dispensations that had allowed uncle, niece, and first cousin marriages among royalty. For centuries after Carlos's death, the true cause of the Habsburg collapse remained mysterious. People attributed it to God's curse, to witchcraft, to bad luck, to weakness of character. But in the 20th and 21st centuries, geneticists finally solved the puzzle. They analyzed the Habsburg family tree, calculating inbreeding coefficients for each generation. They studied the detailed medical descriptions and portraits. They even analyzed DNA from Habsburg remains when possible. The conclusion was undeniable. The Habsburg dynasty didn't fall because of military defeats or political failures. It fell because they poisoned themselves genetically, generation after generation, until they literally bred themselves into extinction. Modern geneticists have shown that if you marry your first cousin, your children have about a 6% chance of serious genetic disorders. Marry your niece, and that risk roughly doubles. But if your parents were cousins, and their parents were cousins, and you marry your cousin or niece, the accumulated genetic damage creates a near certainty of severe problems. The Habsburgs did this for nearly 2 centuries, and Carlos II was the inevitable result, the endpoint of a genetic spiral into oblivion. Today, we look at the portraits of the Habsburg rulers, and we can trace the increasing deformity generation by generation. Early paintings show slight jaw protrusions. Later ones show faces that barely look human, with artists doing their best to make their subjects appear somewhat normal despite the grotesque reality. Carlos's official portraits are particularly haunting. Even with the artist's best efforts to flatter him, you can see the massive jaw, the vacant expression. The drool artists tried to minimize but couldn't completely hide. These paintings hang in museums now, silent witnesses to one of history's most horrific experiments in genetic destruction. The story of the Habsburgs is more than just historical curiosity. It's a brutal lesson in what happens when ideology, whether it's about pure blood, racial superiority, or divine right, overrides basic common sense and natural law. The Habsburgs believed they were special, chosen by God, too important to mix with lesser beings, and that belief killed them more surely than any enemy army ever could. Their obsession with purity created the ultimate impurity, genetic chaos that manifested in bodies and minds so damaged that life itself became suffering. In a way, Carlos II was the perfect symbol of his dynasty's fatal flaw. Just as the empire appeared grand from the outside, but was rotting from within, Carlos appeared to be a king, but was barely capable of independent thought or action. The crown sat heavy on a head that could barely support its weight. So the next time someone talks about pure bloodlines, about keeping things in the family, about not mixing with outsiders, remember Carlos the Bewitched. Remember, a man whose DNA was so tangled by generations of inbreeding that he was born into suffering, lived in constant pain and confusion, and died without leaving a single heir, ending one of history's most powerful dynasties. The Pope didn't have to ban the Habsburgs forever. They banned themselves through their own genetic suicide. Make sure you subscribe to this channel because history is full of stories they don't teach you in school, dark truths that reveal how the mighty really fall. And if you found this fascinating, check out the video on the screen right now about other royal families whose secrets were even more disturbing. Trust me, you won't believe what happened to them. Thanks for watching, and remember, the truth is always stranger and more horrifying than any fiction we could create.